This is the wild history of Jamaica. Imagine an island where escaped slaves defeated one of the most powerful empires on earth, where warriors hid in misty mountains and forced the British Empire to sign peace treaties, where massive slave rebellions shook the Atlantic world and helped end slavery, and where, after centuries of resistance, a small Caribbean island became the first independent nation in the British Caribbean. This is the wild history of Jamaica, a story of invasion, survival, rebellion, and freedom. And it begins more than 500 years ago, before the empires. Long before European ships appeared on the horizon, Jamaica was home to the Taino people. They called the island Zaimaca, meaning land of wood and water. The Taino built fishing villages along the coast and farmed cassava, maize, and sweet potatoes. They navigated the Caribbean in large dugout canoes and maintained trade networks across nearby islands. For generations, Jamaica was peaceful, but that peace ended in 1494. That year, a fleet led by Christopher Columbus arrived in the Caribbean during his second voyage. Spain claimed Jamaica as part of its expanding empire. At first, the island was only lightly settled, but Spanish colonization soon brought devastating change. Disease, forced labor, and violence devastated the Taino population. Within a few decades, their society had nearly collapsed. Spain then began importing enslaved Africans to replace the dying workforce. And with that, the foundations of Jamaica's future struggles were set. The British take the island. For over a century, Jamaica remained a small and relatively unimportant Spanish colony. But in the mid-1600s, another empire was rising in the Caribbean, England. In 1655, an English fleet led by William Penn and General Robert Venables launched an invasion of the island. Spain's defenses were weak. The English quickly captured Jamaica, but the Spanish colonists did something unexpected as they fled. They released many of their enslaved Africans into the island's interior. These men and women escaped into Jamaica's rugged mountains and dense forests. And there, they began building something extraordinary, free communities beyond the reach of colonial rule. These communities would soon become known as the Maroons. Rise of the Maroons, 437-30. The Jamaican Maroons became some of the most skilled guerrilla fighters in the Caribbean. They settled deep in the island's mountainous interior, where the terrain was almost impossible for European armies to navigate. The Maroons developed a way of life built on independence and survival. They farmed the land, they hunted in the forests, and they built hidden villages that were nearly invisible to outsiders. But they also fought. Maroons regularly launched raids on plantations, freeing enslaved people and seizing supplies. British soldiers sent to capture them often vanished in the jungle. Ambushes were common. Paths through the mountains were secret. The forests themselves became a weapon. Among the Maroons, one leader became legendary, a woman named Nanny of the Maroons. Nanny was both a warrior and a spiritual leader. She organized resistance against the British and helped guide her people through years of conflict. Today, she is remembered as one of Jamaica's national heroes. The Maroon Wars. By the early 18th century, the British colonial government had a serious problem. The Maroons were growing stronger, their raids were increasing, and the British Army could not defeat them. The conflict eventually erupted into what historians call the First Maroon War. For years, British soldiers fought in the mountains against fighters who knew every cave, river, and hidden trail. The Maroons struck quickly and disappeared just as fast. European soldiers struggled with the heat, the terrain, and the constant threat of ambush. Many feared entering the mountains at all. After decades of exhausting conflict, the British government made a remarkable decision. Instead of trying to destroy the Maroons, they negotiated with them. Peace treaties with rebels. In 1739, British authorities signed peace treaties with the Maroon communities. It was an extraordinary moment. The British Empire was effectively recognizing the independence of escaped slaves. The treaties granted the Maroons land and autonomy in their mountain territories. Communities like Accompong became legally recognized settlements. In exchange, the Maroons agreed to stop attacking plantations and help maintain peace on the island. The agreement allowed Maroon culture and traditions to survive for centuries. But while the Maroons lived in freedom, the plantation system below continued expanding. And Jamaica was becoming something else entirely. One of the richest colonies in the world. The Sugar Empire. By the late 1700s, Jamaica had become the jewel of Britain's Caribbean empire. The island's plantations produced enormous amounts of sugar. Sugar was one of the most valuable commodities in the Atlantic world. Plantation owners became incredibly wealthy, but that wealth came at an enormous human cost. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans were brought to Jamaica to work the plantations. Life in the sugar fields was brutal. Workdays were long and exhausting. Punishments were severe, and mortality rates were shockingly high. Tensions on the island continued to grow, and eventually, those tensions exploded into one of the largest slave rebellions in Caribbean history. The Baptist War. In 1831, an enslaved preacher named Samuel Sharpe began organizing a protest movement. Sharpe believed enslaved people should refuse to work until they were granted freedom. What began as a peaceful strike quickly turned into a massive uprising. The rebellion became known as the Baptist War. Tens of thousands of enslaved people across Jamaica joined the revolt. Plantations were set on fire. Colonial authorities panicked. British troops were deployed to crush the rebellion. Within weeks, the uprising was brutally suppressed. Many rebels were executed, including Samuel Sharpe himself. But the rebellion had an enormous impact. News of the violence reached Britain and shocked the public. Support for abolition grew rapidly. Just 3 years later, in 1834, slavery was officially abolished across the British Empire. A long road to independence. Even after slavery ended, Jamaica remained under British colonial rule. Economic inequality continued. Political power remained concentrated in the hands of colonial authorities. But movements for self-government slowly gained strength. By the 20th century, calls for independence were growing louder. Political leaders pushed for change. Workers organized protests and strikes. And the idea of a sovereign Jamaica began to take shape. Finally, on August 6, 1962, Jamaica achieved independence from Britain. After centuries of colonization, rebellion, and resistance, the island became a free nation. Jamaica's history is unlike almost any other in the Caribbean. It is a story shaped by rebellion, resilience, and determination. From the Taino people who first called the island home, to the Maroon warriors who defied empire, to the rebels who helped end slavery. Each chapter helped shape the Jamaica we know today, and the legacy of resistance that began in the mountains centuries ago still echoes across the island. Because the story of Jamaica is not just a story about the past. It's a story about the power of people who refuse to surrender their freedom.